Oh, you probably got a match on the pink.
Oh yeah, that's not what I did.
We have our route names going down the left-hand column, our grades from VB to V5, and then the number of points is listed here.
Good evening, please be seated. I've been asked to begin with a public service announcement. In the unlikely event of an emergency, there's an additional exit to the bottom of the stairwell located behind me to my right. Okay. I'd also like to announce that this is the final Founders Day at which Tim Gaylord will be performing on the organ, and he's been performing for 30 years. So I'd like us to give a round of applause for him. And now I'd like to ask the University Singers to perform their opening selection, Nunc de Metes, under the direction of Dr. Shane Lynch. Thank you, University Singers and Dr. Lynch. We celebrate Founders Day and gather for convocation by direction of the Board of Trustees on or near the birthday of Robert E. Lee, who served as our university's president from 1865 to 1870. On this occasion, we reflect upon the people whose vision, leadership, and hard work gave rise to this university, in which we take pride and to which we now devote our own energy. We reflect upon the purposes and the values that abide as the common thread connecting the members of this community across decades and centuries during which so much else has changed. And we reflect upon our motto, non incautus futuri, not unmindful of the future, which expresses our commitment to honor the past, not from a desire to remain frozen in time, but as a source of inspiration to direct our own efforts for the benefit of those who will follow us in the decades and centuries to come. At the heart of Washington and Lee University lies the conviction that the future is best served by education. From that conviction grows the communal ethos to devote ourselves to cultivating the considerable potential of our students, so that they may in turn contribute powerfully to making the world a better place. The two men for whom our school is named exemplified this ethos, as have thousands of other individuals who've sustained the quality, character, and success of this university over the 270 years of its existence. The paintings behind me portray Washington and Lee as they were when they made their direct and transformative contributions to this institution. J. Reed painted Lee in 1866, shortly after he became the president of Washington College. Gilbert Stuart's image of Washington was painted near the end of his second term as the President of the United States in 1796. That's the very same year in which he made his generous gift to Liberty Hall Academy. These portraits remind us not only of the men they depict and of their connections to this university, but also of the importance of our work and of our commitment to serving the public good. George Washington invested in this particular school because he believed the success of the nation depended upon there being quality education on the frontier. The Blue Ridge Mountains were the frontier of the United States, and we were the first institution of higher education to the west of those mountains. George Washington's investment in us was a deliberate investment in the future of the United States. 69 years later, with the nation in tatters after the Civil War, Robert E. Lee accepted the presidency of Washington College because it offered him a chance to contribute to rebuilding the newly reunited states. Putting this small, struggling college on the path to becoming an outstanding modern university was Lee's primary contribution to the future of the country. We continue to serve the public good. Our mission commits us to providing a liberal arts education that prepares students for lives of responsible leadership, service to others, and engaged citizenship in a global and diverse society. The investments of time and resources and love that our faculty and staff make in these young people are paid forward by the positive differences that so many of our students, and especially those who were here tonight as initiates of Omicron Delta Kappa, the National Leadership Honor Society, founded here at Washington and Lee, make on our campus and in our community. The work that we're doing with respect to our institutional history reflects this same commitment to advancing our educational mission for the sake of the greater good. We're determined to teach and present our history and all of its entanglements with the history of America as well as we possibly can, for the benefit of everyone at W&L and the wider public. The leader of these efforts is Dr. Lynn Rainville, our inaugural Director of Institutional History. She's charged with developing projects in collaboration with faculty, staff, students, and alumni that engage the community with the full scope of our history. She will spearhead the development of a museum devoted to the history of Washington and Lee and its many connections to American history. She will pursue partnerships with other historical sites around the region that share our goal of providing public education of the highest quality and can help us realize the full potential of W&L's campus, buildings, and collections. Dr. Rainville was selected after a highly competitive national search, during which she impressed us with her wide-ranging curiosity, dedication to meticulous research, and enthusiasm for exploring the many and varied stories that comprise our history. Since beginning her work on July 1st, just 6 short months ago, Lynn's expertise and energy have been evident to everyone who's met with her, or heard one of the dozens of presentations she's given in classrooms, to alumni groups, and to community organizations. Dr. Rainville is a public historian and anthropologist with a bachelor's degree in anthropology and history from Dartmouth College and an MA and PhD in anthropology and archaeology from the University of Michigan. She brings to W&L more than 2 decades of experience in higher education, having taught at Sweetbriar, the University of Virginia, Dartmouth, and the University of Michigan. At Sweetbriar, she also directed the Tusculum Institute for Virginia History and Historic Preservation and served as dean of the college. Dr. Rainville's written 4 books on Virginia history, ranging from the role of Virginians in World War I to the history of African American cemeteries in the Commonwealth. Her most recent book on the history of Sweetbriar is entitled Invisible Founders: How 2 Centuries of African American Families Transformed a Plantation into a College. Last fall, when the Chronicle of Education interviewed Lynn about her appointment to her new position, they asked about the challenge of addressing what the Chronicle termed complicated histories. She replied with characteristic wisdom, "People can always have different perspectives, but we can come to a sense of common facts that lend themselves to different interpretations, but that are based in evidence." Lynn brings that evidence-based approach to everything she does, and we're fortunate to have her at Washington and Lee. The title of her talk tonight is Untold Stories of Founders, Leaders, and Other Visionaries of W&L. Please join me in welcoming our first Director of Institutional History, Dr. Lynn Rainville.
I am honored to be here in front of you to share some thoughts about founders and to serve as a prequel to your induction into a century-old honor society that was founded here in 1914. When I was first asked to give this talk, I started to prepare the way that I have for over 25 years of giving public presentations. I started compiling visual images. In fact, since 1993, when I first presented my history thesis at Dartmouth, there have only been a handful of occasions when I have not used slides, either real slides or, of course, more recently, PowerPoint images. So for today's talk, I was so focused on showing illustrations that I mentioned my plans in passing to some of the many individuals who have spent countless hours organizing tonight's event. And with true Southern politeness, they gave me a long stare, waited a moment, and then showed me the very intricate floor plans and preparations that basically scripts every moment here, and then asked me to take a look at where the where the screen would come down if I were to use it, and basically plus or minus, it would be inches away from the president's head. And that's when I realized I would have to do this a little bit differently. And it was also when I refocused on what the actual problem was. It wasn't that I was committed to showing PowerPoint, it was that as an archaeologist and anthropologist, I was committed to using artifacts to tell our history. And that to me remains a critical way to uncover some of the various layers of this, as I guess I said, but as quoted in the Chronicle of Higher Education, this complicated history. So as a result, I finally came to the realization that speaking to you here in this century, 150-year-old building, that I had all the visuals that I needed at hand in this room. So if you will bear with me, for the remainder of my comments, I will be telling some of these stories about founders and leaders, referencing the iconography and the plaques and the memorials that surround us. So that way I can have my cake and eat it too. So the architectural history of this building provides one of the storylines to our history. The construction of this building began in 1867 and was finished just in time for graduation in 1868. Lacking a suitable spot to gather the entire body, President Lee designed the chapel as an auditorium, first and foremost, not as a church. And in fact, it has never been consecrated, and although you sit in pews, your pews lack racks to hold holy books such as a Bible. After Robert Lee's death, the apse behind me was added to serve as a memorial and a mausoleum. And gradually, as its use as a place of worship decreased, its role as a gathering place for intellectual and academic purposes increased. And this includes a very well-known speech by Charles Francis Adams, Jr., the great-grandson of U.S. President John Adams and the grandson of John Quincy Adams. During the Civil War, he led the 5th Massachusetts, which was a black cavalry regiment, into Richmond towards the very end of the war. Adams gave his speech here at this very lectern on the centennial of Lee's birth on January 19, 1907. He spoke for an hour and a quarter, which is not foreshadowing for my talk. And his conciliatory remarks are commemorated by a plaque that lies on the second story behind you that you would have to view after the talk. And it shows in bas relief his profile. And that was added to honor the talk that he gave. It was a very momentous talk. In addition, the Victorian style of this building, along with its simplified Romanesque interior, as well as its connection to Robert E. Lee, provided the rationale for adding this chapel to the elite list of National Historic Landmarks in 1961. And as you entered, there was a plaque at the very back of the building that commemorated this event. There's only one other National Historic Landmark in Rockbridge, and that's the barracks at VMI. And these landmarks represent 3% of the 90,000 sacred and historic sites that are on the National Historic Register, which is, of course, a much larger group of sites. And so, for example, here in Rockbridge County, we have 48 sites on the National Historic Register, but it is quite an honor to be a National Historic Landmark. I should add that efforts are ongoing with local groups partnering with regional and national institutions to do research into the cabins of enslaved families here in Rockbridge and into historic barns so that we can add more sites to the National Historic Register, which requires both deep historic research and a rationale for cultural and historic significance. But there are other elements of this building that we can look to and learn from, and that would be include the carefully coordinated design elements. So the same sawtooth pattern that was found on the outer doors as you walked in, which also is seen in the balcony and on the lectern in front of me, the zigzag. This was also a stylistic element that originally behind me, the alcove, was a window. I mean, the windows where the portraits are now, and then the window that was behind me. And in a very famous picture of Lee, taken at Lee's funeral during the wake, with two students watching over the coffin on either side, you can clearly see in the window that this repeated zigzagging pattern continues from, therefore, front to back to create a symbolically coherent design. You'll also notice on the lectern in front of me the acorn motif. This is deployed throughout the building. Acorns are, of course, very rich in symbolism. As the seed of an oak tree, they are often associated with strength and potential. And accordingly, the Lee family crest features a squirrel holding an acorn. And this visual metaphor was accompanied by the family motto, which is the motto that we take for the university, which is non incautus futuri, or not unmindful of the future. And I should add that the lectern in front of me that has acorn design includes the mother of all acorns in the center, which looks like it has already eaten several other acorns. So this design also occurs in a modified form as a finial at the base of the connectors in the ceiling. And then behind me, in the entranceway. So once you start looking for acorns, basically in this building, you will see them everywhere. And as for the lectern itself, you will see a singular added decoration, the Odk Medallion. It is there, right? Good. Forgot to check when I walked in. This is the only decoration that is ever allowed on this 1868 lectern. In fact, if you notice closely, none of us are supposed to touch the lectern, which is why even the comments are on top of felt. So I am not touching the lectern. And this decoration is a powerful symbol that commemorates the founding of the Honor Society. And in fact, it has another layer of history. If we were to turn it around and look at the back of it, it was given by Captain Peniston, who was the director of Lee Chapel decades ago, and it was in honor of his son, who was an alum of the university, who died tragically from an illness his senior year at school. So he gave it in honor of that. So it is not as old as some of the other artifacts in this room, but still helps us document our history. And the symbolism on it, which of course includes the 5 stars, which relate to the 5 phases of collegiate leadership celebrated by ODK: scholarship, athletics, campus and community service, communications, and the arts. And then the circle is meant to encompass all of those entities, as well as the date of 1914, when it was founded. So for the rest of this talk, I'll be using some of the other plaques and memorials that surround us to highlight chapters and accomplishments of W&L leaders. And I begin with what was most likely the very first adornment in the chapel, and that's the plaque directly in front of me at the very rear of the chapel in the center. And if you look at it afterwards, you will see that that plaque is actually embedded into the wall. It doesn't just hang on the wall. And moreover, when you put together the storyline and the date, you'll realize that it was most likely added in 1879. Well, in 1879, the apse behind me had not been completed, and thus the statue was not yet placed here. That did not occur until 1883. So originally, that was probably the one and only adornment in the chapel. Unfortunately, the origins of it is a tragic story. It's dedicated to William C. Lynch, who was a student who died on Christmas Day while he was trying to save the life of a fellow student in the river. And it was erected by his friends in June of 1879. The power of these plaques is that they commemorate people and events. And for most of us, the event and the ritual that we regularly commemorate in our own lives are birthdays. And this is, of course, a very appropriate moment to be talking about significant birthdays here in our community. But history has an interesting light to shed on something that you might not think has an interesting backstory. I think it's safe to say in this room that everyone knows their birthday. But for most of human history, this basic part of one's identity was considered irrelevant and for the most part went unrecorded. Or in the case of ancient Romans, they would only celebrate men's birthday, and it wasn't until the 12th century that they began celebrating women's birthdays. And also within their tradition, it was only individuals who would celebrate their 50th birthday who received a cake. But their version of a cake was wheat flour, olive oil, honey, and grated cheese. After that brief experiment with birthday cakes, it wasn't until the 18th century that the Germans introduced a Kinderfest, which honored children's birthdays, and it was very specifically for children. And they also introduced birthday candles, again, part of our ritual today. And in this country, birthday cakes did not become popular until the 19th century, which accompanied the rise of industrialism and more affordable ready-made cake mixes. But it was only after all these developments and in the 20th century that most states in America began regularly issuing birth certificates and formally requiring the formal recording of births. So all of that is a very recent historic occurrence. And I say this background and why it is relevant is because of an unexpected example of an uncertain birth date, and that would be of Robert E. Lee. So the commonly accepted date of January 19th, 1807 is used very, very widely, but there are several scholars who have certainly shed some interesting perspectives on that date. And one of them is Elizabeth Pryor, who wrote the book Reading the Man, a very comprehensive biography of Lee. And she wrote or had uncovered that on the 1829 West Point roster of students, where Lee was then a student, Lee himself gave his age in 1829 as 19 years and 4 months when he was admitted. And if you do the math, that puts his birth date around March of 1806. So different month, different year. Another very well-known biographer of Lee, Douglas Southall Freeman, included an image in his 1930 book of the Lee family Bible. And this is one of the only places that we regularly find, prior to the 20th century, where we regularly find recorded birth dates. So it's a very good source to use usually. And there, although his birth date is listed as January 19th, 1807, it's clear that the 7 in 1800 was first a 6, and then someone crossed it out and made it a 7. And since this Bible belonged to Robert E. Lee's mother, you would normally assume that she would be the expert on this matter. And then Lee himself wrote a letter in February 28th, 1824, saying that he had completed my 18th year on the 29th of last January. So now assuming what he said was true, that puts his birth date at January 29th, not 19th, and 1805, not 1807. And to add more confusion, January 29th, that is his father's birthday, Light Horse Harry Lee. And my point here is not to devolve into we could never know, or to turn this into a David Brown book. It's instead to point out how valuable it is to consult multiple sources and to include different techniques. And in this case, I will not be the arbiter of his birthday, but I will leave it in the hands of the talented scholars at Stratford Hall, where Colin Woodward, the editor of the Lee Family Digital Archive, is doing what would be the logical next step, which is to look in family papers, letters, for any mention of the baby Robert prior to January 19th, 1807. So I expect at some point there will be a resolution. And not to sound like I'm just using strange examples of our two founders, but there's also an interesting twist on the birth date for George Washington. But here it has to do with the process of commemoration, which is just as important as the historic advancement of facts in real time. So for George Washington, he was born on February 11th in 1731. But as many of you will realize, 20 years later, the British colonies switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian one under the Calendar Act of 1750. So, and this made a transition from the old style dates to the new style dates of the Gregorian calendar, which means that individuals like Washington, who were born prior to 1750 but died after 1750, have a complication in their birth dates, because you have to decide if you're going to stick with the old style date even after the calendar changed, or rewrite their old style date into the new style date. Don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz afterwards, by the way, with all these dates. But dates are relevant, and again, the process and the chronological order of events is important. So in this case, it's not a question of being out of order chronologically, but we celebrate Washington's birth on the Gregorian date, which is February 22nd, 1732, as opposed to how he and his contemporaries would have, which is February 11th of 1731. And just to add one last complication, in 1971 in this country, we created the Uniform Federal Holidays Act, and that declared that it is officially correct to celebrate Washington's birthday anytime between February 15th and the 21st. So this, of course, has morphed into President's Day, honoring all of those who served as president, not just George Washington. And then similarly here today, as we celebrate Founders' Day, honoring the multiple individuals who were critical in founding this institution. So using these two examples to demonstrate that the past is knowable, but we have to use a very careful scrutiny, and historians and other social scientists and humanists have to engage with different techniques and multiple layers. I would close here before moving to the next part. If I were showing slides right now, I would be taking this moment to make sure that everyone was still awake, and I would be quizzing everyone on where the ODK commemorative plaque is. And I'll give you a hint, it is not in this building. So make sure you have an answer to that next time I see you. So on the subject of foundings, I return back to the question of who we commemorate as founders, especially in this building with plaques. So here we learn about our 18th century founders. So located on the left-hand side at the rear of the chapel is a very unusual memorial made from blue marble, and it includes bas-relief Ionic columns with an ornate entablature. It's really quite lovely, and it's much more ornate than most of the rectangular ones. And this artifact memorializes two principals of the Augusta Academy, the one that was founded in 1749, Robert Alexander and John Brown, and then William Graham, who was the founding rector of the Liberty Hall Academy. And I use this plaque as a perfect illustration of how we can use material culture to ask more nuanced questions of the past. So the appropriate place to begin with any study of a commemorative act, such as a plaque, is who decided to remember this person, and why. And in the case in the back, the plaque informs us that it was the Colonial Dames of America who erected the plaque on June 10th in 1913. And they did it to honor the colonial founders. So this raises the question, well, who are the Colonial Dames? And they're a national society formed in 1891 to, and I quote, promote appreciation for the people, places, and events that led to the formation and development of our country, end quote. They have been leaders in the field of historic preservation and interpretation of historic sites, for over a century now. So in this case, so in that sense, it does make sense that an organization devoted to the colonial era would provide us with a plaque to commemorate our foundings. But if we look closer at the plaque and the details on it, we see that the dates that they use are 1749 to 1782 as the period that they want to commemorate. 1782 is a very strange choice because that was the year that the Reverend Graham arrived. So it's not an end date, even though they use it as the end date of their commemorative moment. And I would add here, it's even stranger because the plaque, as I mentioned a moment ago, was dedicated in 1913. That was 2 years after Graham's body was exhumed from Richmond and reburied just outside. So he is the individual, as you face the chapel on the left, who is buried in between the wrought iron gates on a horizontal table memorial. So the dates of his presidency, though, in 1913 would have been well known. He was very much on people's minds. And right now I can't tell you why the Colonial Dames picked 1782, seeing as they're commemorating this in 1913, it would have made much more sense for them to pick 1796, which was the end of President Graham's tenure as a founder of the Liberty Hall Academy. And although one could argue that because they were focused on the colonial era, that they wanted to stick within a tighter time frame that they would want to commemorate, but 1782 is not that date. So this is one of the many research questions that I've been uncovering as the inaugural director, which I hope many of the students in this room and faculty and staff will help with continued and ongoing research. Another point about this plaque is why 1913? The association at that point was 22 years old, and that was a year that they turned their attention to a rural school in Virginia. Now, maybe they were erecting memorials at each of the American colleges founded in the 18th century, again, true to their own mission, to appreciate the colonial era. Maybe one of the women in the Colonial Dames was descended from one of the 22 trustees that are also named on the plaque. Or maybe the large number of Revolutionary War officers that were connected with our founding caught their attention. Because on that plaque, you'll see that we have a general, 4 colonels, 1 major, and 3 captains. But thinking and researching laterally, another catalyst may have been another reburial. 1 month before that plaque was commemorated, Light Horse Harry Lee, Robert E. Lee's father, was exhumed and reinterred in the crypt below us. That was the date that they moved him here. So perhaps the attention that was being called to this very famous Revolutionary War hero being moved here physically caught their attention. All of these questions are, again, part of ongoing research to help us understand what is and is not being commemorated on the plaques around us. I mean, we can all appreciate, given the finite number, well, the finite amount of wall space and then the finite a number of plaques, that clearly the plaques themselves haven't caught the whole story, but they certainly raise lots of interesting questions. So in addition to the founders that many of the plaques around us highlight, I also wanted to point to some of the other types of leadership that are commemorated here. And one of the most notable ones is military leadership. Several of these plaques commemorate veterans and their service. And here as a historian, I wanted to give very brief context for some of the, our alumni have fought in all of the major wars and conflicts since we were founded. And in this region, we occupy the lands of former Native confederacies, such as the Monacans, the Monahawk, and Sioux-speaking groups. So as a result, the European American founders of Rockbridge County ended up fighting Native peoples for land and resources as they were founding in this region. And just after the founding of the Augusta Academy was the outbreak of the French Indian Wars. And many of our faculty, our early faculty here, were educated at Princeton, where they would have been on some of the front lines of that battle. And this brings us back to George Washington, who began his military career as a British soldier in this conflict. Now, of course, the war that Washington is much more famous for is his success in the Revolutionary War. And here again, we have Washington and Lee, pupils of William Graham, the same founder, fighting against Cornwallis at the Battle of Guilford Court, not all that far from here. If I skip over the War of 1812, apologies, everyone skips the War of 1812. I don't yet have information about our alumni in the War of 1812, I'm sure it's there. But returning to the stories of leadership that we find in the plaques in this building, you will have all passed as you came in the one that commemorates the service of our alumni in the Civil War. And that would be the Liberty Hall Volunteers, named after, taking their name from our colonial era educational institution. And the Liberty Hall itself, that they're named after, it's the ruins that burned in 1803, and after it burned, they were incorporated into a plantation owned by Archibald Alexander. And archaeologists and archivists here have spent thousands of hours documenting the lives of the dozens of enslaved laborers who worked at this site, and as the debris from writing tablets and implements indicates, taught themselves to read and write there. The plaque at the back records the 76 students Washington College students, who served in the unit. And it's the only one in this building that plaque in this building that recognizes another important historic trend, and that would be the connection between us and our local community. So the base of the plaque includes the 106 volunteers and recruits from Rockbridge County and their casualties. And of course, the plaque raises another question, which is what is missing from that storyline? And in this case, it's the service of our Union veterans, and Professor Barton Myers and his students are continuing their research into this so far untold part of our history of not a large number, but the small number of our students who went to fight for the North. Perhaps one of the most illustrative examples here of a founding leader who was both inspirational and visionary is the tragic story of Kiffin Rockwell, and his plaque lies in the middle on the right-hand side. Rockwell and his brother wrote to the French Consul General and offered their services to France the day after Germany declared war, which back in 1914, years before America joined the conflict. In the letter, Rockwell said he was paying his part of the debt owed to Lafayette and Rochambeau. They joined the French Foreign Legion and became the first Americans to enter World War I. Along with 6 other Americans, Kiffin formed the Escadrille Americaine, and 30 more Americans joined them in the following months, and it was renamed the Lafayette Escadrille. This was a series of American aviators who were fighting on behalf of the French and their allies. In 1916, Kiffin shot down the first German plane destroyed in combat by an American aviator. And unfortunately, on September 23rd, 1916, while in combat with another German plane, Kiffin was shot in the chest and killed, just 3 days after his 23rd birthday. Keeping in mind, this is still a year before America joins the war. He was buried in France with full military honors and was referred to by Theodore Roosevelt as the Lafayette of the air. And the plaque in the middle was placed there in memory of him by his fraternity brothers at Sigma Phi Epsilon. So we also have a plaque here to service in World War II, which has an interesting twist to it that reminds us that our history has many different people in it. And the plaque at the back, which is a plaque to the School of Army Personnel, this, in 1942, when enrollment, in the middle of the World War II, when enrollment was down by 300 students, on December 7th of 42, on the first anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Army School arrived on campus and continued here for many, many years and offered training in a diverse set of hands-on military-related skills. And the plaque at the back, which is upstairs, honors these individuals who, for that space of the war, included women and African Americans who were training to serve their country. And then one of the last military plaques at the back, which recognizes a member of the class of 1966 for his sacrifice in Vietnam. And this was James Monroe, who was killed on the 16th of February, 1967, after he crawled through heavy fire to provide aid to his wounded comrades and ultimately saved the lives of 2 of them and injuries to many others by smothering a live grenade with his own body. And because of his heroic and selfless action, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the nation's highest military honor. If you're interested in a more complete list of our alumni who have served in various wars, you can also, as you leave, as you head through the Memorial Gate, which is in front of the visitors' parking lot, that was erected as a memorial to the Great War, at the time when obviously they hoped there would not be any other wars, but then subsequently, the university has added plaques commemorating veterans from World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. So moving forward with this material culture and artifacts, if we turn to the 2 portraits of our well-known leaders, I have to admit that when I was asked to speak to inductees in an honor society that is based on leadership, the next step I took was to Google leadership. Because as an anthropologist, I am more accustomed to the impacts of cultural beliefs on leadership. So for example, how female leaders are perceived as opposed to their male counterparts. I spend less time studying how individuals achieve their successes or the variabilities of leadership styles. So in preparation for this talk, I read Doris Kearns Goodwin's masterful book titled Leadership in Turbulent Times. And she, as a historian, bases her conclusions on the lives of Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. And in this, she identified 4 types of leadership: transformational, crisis management, turnaround leaders, and visionary ones. And the 2 men on either side of me in the portraits obviously embody each of these types at various points in their career. So from his start as a 21-year-old Army major, George Washington embodied most of these styles. And as the author Richard Brookhiser put it in contemporary terms, describing Washington as the founding CEO, he explained his reasonings. Washington ran 2 startups, the American presidency and the American Army. He chaired the most important committee meeting in history. That would be the 1787 Constitutional Convention. His agribusiness and real estate portfolio made him America's richest man at the time. And he was an 18th century celebrity. Men followed him into battle, and women longed to dance with him at parties. And it wasn't just military acumen. He solved problems ranging from smallpox to treason. And finally, as only the strongest and most confident leaders recognize, he knew when to step down after 2 terms as president, thereby setting a precedent for an elected office, not a dictatorship. And as the painting on my left illustrates, one of the most interesting aspects of Lee's leadership for us here at W&L is him as an educator. And I have to add that if you look very closely at this portrait, you can see that one of the books in the back has the word history in it. It's actually very hard to read, but it's there. So in the summer of 1865, the trustees of Washington College approached him about becoming president. He was willing to take the job, but he had some concerns about bringing dishonor to the school, since he didn't yet know at that moment if he would be tried for treasons. And in his own words, he feared that his role in the war might, quote, draw upon the college a feeling of hostility, end quote, in some quarters. Now, after arriving in Lexington, he quickly focused on two major construction projects, this chapel and his house, what becomes the president's house. And he also strengthened Washington College's commitment to practical courses within the framework of a liberal arts education. As Lee explained, quote, "The great object of the whole place is to provide the facilities required by a large class of our young men who, looking to an early entrance into the practical pursuits of life, need a more direct training to this end than usual literary courses," end quote. He planned to apply the advances in industry and science to the literary instruction of the post-war generation. His next-door colleague, the superintendent of VMI, described this plan as, and I quote, "twaddle from beginning to end," end quote. And this is an important reminder that strong leaders need to do thorough research and then follow through with their convictions. Obviously, Lee did, and some of his educational initiatives, while some of them did not survive his presidency, others are embedded in what is today our unique offerings of a graduate program in law alongside accredited training in business and journalism, all within an elite liberal arts education. A moment ago, I mentioned visionary leadership. In my short time at Washington and Lee, this is perhaps the most compelling type of student and alumni contributions that I have seen. This includes recent graduates who are dedicating their lives to solving critical environmental, social, and economic problems, and older alums who have succeeded at solving complex problems while leading others. So, again, turning to the plaques, I wanted to highlight two last individuals. And the first is William Morrison, who entered Washington and Lee when he was 16, walking 6 miles to school each day to study law. After he graduated, he applied to the Executive Committee of Foreign Missions and received an appointment as a missionary to Africa. He was stationed in the Congo, and he came into direct contact with King Leopold II of Belgium and quickly realized the atrocities that the king was committing against the indigenous populations. This was all in an effort. The king was interested in promoting the rubber trade, and he was enslaving local people to meet certain, to produce certain amounts of rubber every day that was basically killing people. And William Morrison used his privileged status as an educated white American Christian to draw the entire world's attention to Leopold's exploitative practices through letters, articles, testaments, and trials. And eventually, Morrison encouraged the eradication of Leopold's labor system by the Belgian government after they purchased the territory. And the plaque, sorry, his is right here, his plaque commemorates his service and that of his wife who joined him, where they both died, which was in the Congo. And the second example of a committed and visionary leader is James Ambler. At age 16, he volunteered for a cavalry regiment and fought in the Civil War. And he was one of the students who attended Washington College just after the war ended, between 1865 and 67. Later, he graduated with a medical degree from the University of Maryland, and he joined the U.S. Navy. His superiors suggested that he offer to serve as a medical officer in what became a doomed Arctic expedition in 1878 that was designed to approach the North Pole through the Bering Strait. He was not eager, but no one else responded, so he felt duty-bound to go. A newspaper publisher provided the ship, the Jeannette, and George Washington DeLong commanded the expedition. They left San Francisco in 1879 with 33 people, but after just 2 months, they became icebound, and they remained imprisoned on their ship in the ice for 21 months. It was Ambler's skillful practice of medicine that preserved the crew's health with daily rations of lime juice, a distillery to produce potable water from salty sea ice, and he established rigorous standards of sanitation and hygiene that saved, most likely, all of their lives initially. Unfortunately, on June 11, 1881, the wooden hull of the ship was crushed by ice, and so the group had to leave to search for open water. And after 3 months, they reached the edge of the ice pack, and they divided into 3 boatloads. The first boat was sunk by a gale. Siberians rescued the second boat, but the ship containing DeLong, Ambler, and 12 men became lost in inlets. And at the end, DeLong, the leader of the expedition, offered Ambler a chance to join with 2 of the strongest crew members to seek help. But Ambler declined and remained to stay with some of the sick on the boat. Those individuals who remained on the boat with Ambler ended up starving to death, and in the end, gnawing on leather from their own boots. Whereas the 2 stronger crew members made it out alive and then were able to tell rescuers, who by the time they returned, everyone was dead. But it was upon that return that they learned that after 2 weeks without food at that moment, the 32-year-old doctor penned a final note to his brother stating that he had little hope of surviving. And when they retrieved the bodies, in Ambler's body, they were able to give a gold watch and a red silk scarf that were found in his pocket to his mother. And this, to me, is part of the power of these artifacts that surround us here, but artifacts in general and how much they can mean to us. Dr. Ambler's body was brought back and buried in Fauquier County, here in Virginia, where he's from. And whereas the plaque here recognizes his leadership and sacrifice. And it too, like many of the plaques in this room, were erected by his college friends and classmates. And at the end of the inscription it reads, "He declined the last chance of life that he might help his comrades. His last written words were the confident expression of his Christian faith. To him, duty was the noblest word in the English language." So I want to end on a more upbeat note. Tonight, each of the inductees carries a piece of material culture with them that commemorates this ceremony, and that would be the Odk key. Earlier, I discussed the symbolic meaning of the design of this key, and I want to close with a reference to one part of the design, and that would be the second letter, or the letter delta, which is also the mathematical symbol for change. There are many ways to define and excel at leadership. Some of the most successful will listen to feedback so that they can adapt to challenges and be willing to change their strategies depending on the context. So on the day after we honored the legacy of Reverend Martin Luther King, I wanted to relate a powerful story of a leader who changed his approach after listening. And that would be while Dr. King was giving his famous speech on August 28th, 1963, and as any of you who are either there in person or who have watched the video of this, you can clearly see that for the first couple minutes of his talk, he is reading off of a prepared speech. The speech was compiled after a night of brainstorming with King and many of his colleagues, and then was compiled and written down by his professional speechwriter. But after several minutes into the speech, he pauses, and Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer and a good friend of his, shouted, "Tell them about the dream." Now, most speakers, especially ones reading, like myself, from a prepared talk, would nod politely and continue as planned. But instead, King pushed aside his prepared remarks and improvised much of the second half of that speech, which includes the now famous and inspirational "I Have a Dream." This is a very impressive form of responsive leadership. Now, I should add that the concept of "I Have a Dream" was not improvised on the spot. He had been talking about that in other moments, but he was not planning on doing it at that speech at that moment. So I want to end tonight's talk with an invitation. Every day I decipher more pieces to the 271 years of compelling stories and contributions here at Washington and Lee. This talk represents clearly a very small fraction of those discoveries. And I know this is a little bit unusual, but given that after my talk right now, there's no time for Q&A, I want to invite you to continue this conversation tomorrow morning so that you can ask questions, provide other perspectives, or bring more information. And perhaps as important, I will be offering coffee and donuts, Pure Eats donuts, in CGL 211 from 8 o'clock to 8:45 in the morning. And I do encourage, and especially the students, not just the inductees, to join me for coffee and donuts and continue this ongoing dialogue. Thank you very much.
thank you, Lynn. She's done a lot of discovering in 6 months, I think, and I want to reiterate how fortunate we are to have her here, and I look forward to how much you will help us uncover in the coming years. I didn't know, for example, that I'm not supposed to touch the podium. I think I may have done that on a previous occasion, I confess, but I promise never to do it again. Founders Day is a time for us to recognize individuals for fulfilling the ideals of leadership and service, and we do that on this occasion by inducting them into Omicron Delta Kappa, the National Leadership Honor Society. Laura Rose Calhoun is the president of the Alpha Circle of ODK. She's a senior from Warrensville, North Carolina, a double major in strategic communication and politics with a minor in poverty and human capability studies. She's a Johnson Scholar who's worked to expand and celebrate the sense of community at W&L. She founded the W&L Rotaract Club, which is affiliated with the Lexington Sunrise Rotary Club, and is committed to building community through service with its motto of service above self. She also helped organize the 2018 art exhibit, The Unfreedom of Expression, Artworks from Augusta Correctional Center, which showcased the talents of men incarcerated at Augusta Correctional Center in Craigsville, Virginia. Laura participated in the Washington Term Program as a sophomore and interned at the Habitat for Humanity International Government Relations and Advocacy Office. On campus, she's the Ring Tum Phi's Arts and Life section editor. Off campus, Laura is a member of the Taster's Choice Fundraising Committee, which raises money to provide scholarships for local children to attend the Yellow Brick Road Early Learning Center. After working each Monday night at the community table for the Rockridge area since her sophomore year, Laura was invited to serve a special term this year on the organization's board of directors. Please join me in welcoming Laura to the podium.
Thank you, President Dudley, for your kind introduction. I would also like to welcome our distinguished guests, students, families, and friends as we gather to celebrate the extraordinary accomplishments of our new initiates and anticipate their continued excellence in leadership, both here at Washington and Lee and in communities across the world. Just over a century ago, a select group of 15 Washington and Lee student and faculty leaders founded Omicron Delta Kappa to bring together leaders involved in the various spheres of college activities for the general good of the institution. Since its founding, the Society has sought to honor those students, faculty, alumni, and community members who best demonstrate excellence in the 5 areas recognized by the Society: scholarship, athletics, service, journalism, and the arts. Many of our initiates excel in more than one of these fields, while others represent incredible depth within a single sphere. It can be easy to be a bad leader. Being the loudest person in the room at a poignant moment, or masking selfish ideas as ones that benefit the greater good, may earn you a leadership position, but they don't make you a leader. True leadership is built upon service. It's built upon genuine love, compassion, and empathy for the people around you. It's built upon collaboration. Good leaders are not the loudest people in the room. They're the most thoughtful listeners. We just celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, dedicated to a man who was an incredible leader. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King reads, "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" We should all be striving for that kind of selfless leadership. Good leadership isn't about the leader. It's about standing up for something that matters, working with people who matter, and making positive change. I'm honored to stand here and read each of these names because I know that all of you are striving to be Dr. King's idea of a selfless leader. You're careful and kind and diligent. When the future seems terrifying, I'm encouraged by the work I see all of you doing on this campus, in this community, and beyond. Your leadership and your passion shine, and we need more of that in the world. Thank you for your dedication and your perseverance, and I'm so excited to see what the future holds as your leadership grows. We will now recognize each of our initiates through the traditional tapping ceremony. I'll begin today with our Honorary Initiates. I'll recognize each individually and ask that you please hold your applause until all of them have been introduced. All right. Jennifer Jean Agesta, class of 2000, is Director of Polling and Election Analytics at CNN. Named to the position in January 2015, Agesta produces all the network's polling and leads its election night decision team while guiding CNN's reporting on the use of polls. She works out of CNN's Washington, D.C. bureau. Prior to joining CNN, Agesta served as Director of Polling at the Associated Press. There, she ran a 2-person polling unit, conducting domestic and international survey research for the News Cooperative and leading its election night exit poll coverage. She has also covered polling at the Washington Post, launching the site's polling blog, Behind the Numbers, and helped build the National Election Pool exit poll operation at Edison Research. Prior to her media work, Agesta worked on messaging research with DC firms Belden, Rossinello, and Stewart and Greenberg Quinlan Rosner. Agesta is a native of Long Island. Leo Paul Decanini, class of 95, began volunteering with his local Pittsburgh Habitat for Humanity affiliate in 1988 and worked 3 summers on the Appalachian Service Project. At Washington and Lee, he worked with the Rockbridge County Habitat affiliate and, in 1993, helped found the Washington and Lee Habitat campus chapter that is still active today. Upon graduation, he moved to Northern Virginia and went to work as a project manager for the large national builders U.S. Home Corps and Toll Brothers. He started his own company, Deco Homes and Remodeling, Inc., in 2003. From 1995 to 2009, Leo continued to volunteer with Prince William County Habitat, Northern Virginia Habitat, the Jimmy Carter Work Project, Hurricane Katrina Relief, and Christmas in April. In 2009, he and his family moved back to Lexington, where he was the general contractor on the restoration of the historic Robert E. Lee Hotel on Main Street. He continued to serve, working on Hurricane Maria relief, and as a volunteer, committee chair, and board member for the local Rockbridge area Habitat for Humanity affiliate. In 2017, he began his dream job as the construction supervisor and volunteer coordinator for Rockbridge area Habitat. Leo lives in Lexington with his wife, Pina, class of 95, his 2 children, Gina and Leo, and their dog, Rocky. Tamara Yvette Futrell is the Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Student Engagement at Washington and Lee University. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University in 1994 and a Master of Science degree in college and community counseling from Longwood University in 1996. She is currently a doctoral candidate in the higher education program at Virginia Polytechnic and State University. Futrell serves as a member of the Student Affairs Division, the President's Council, and an ex officio member of the university's Committee on Inclusiveness and Campus Climate. She also served as a member of the steering committee for the university's 2018 strategic plan. At Washington and Lee, Futrell provides leadership and direction for diversity and inclusion programming, services, and initiatives within student affairs. John X. Miller Jr., class of 77 and class of 80 law, is a veteran journalist, newsroom leader, and not-for-profit executive. Miller began his career with an internship at the Twin City Centennial in the 1970s. From 1978 to 1982, he worked as a copy editor for the Roanoke Times and World News, and as a sports copy editor for the Charlotte Observer. Miller then became an original staff member of USA Today when he was hired as the newspaper's sports copy desk chief in 1982. In 1991, he was named executive director of The Reporter in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. In 1996, he was appointed managing editor of the Sun News in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. From 1999 to 2007, Miller worked at the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit Media Partnership, first as the Free Press's public editor, then as the DMP's Director of Community Affairs. While at the Free Press, Miller formed an accuracy group and made accuracy a part of the culture at the paper. After the Free Press, Miller took some time away from journalism to work as chief executive of a nonprofit that helps low-income people pay their utility bills. 3 years later, he became editor of the Daily Record in Hickory, North Carolina. In August of 2013, Miller became the first African-American managing editor of the Winston-Salem Journal. Miller has served on the boards of numerous organizations, including the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education, the Pew Center for Civic Journalism, and the Michigan Humanities Council, as well as various American Society of News Editors and Associated Press Media Editors boards and committees. He was a founding member of the National Association of Minority Media Executives and is the former board chairman of Arise Detroit. He has been a Pulitzer Prize juror, a facilitator at the American Press Institute in Reston, Virginia, and was the first Donald W. Reynolds Distinguished Visiting Professor of Journalism at Washington and Lee University in 2005. Miller received the Order of the Arrow Vigil Honor from the Boy Scouts of America in 1973 and the Spark Plug Award from the Chicora District Boy Scouts of America in 1997. Jessica Lonholm Willett, class of 95, is the Chief Communications Officer at Washington and Lee, overseeing publications, media relations, photography, videography, and social and digital media. She earned her bachelor's magna cum laude with honors. She began her career in book publishing at Random House, Inc., now Penguin Random House, working in various marketing roles, including manager of promotion for Vintage and Anchor Books and director of new media and online marketing for the Knopf Publishing Group. She returned to W&L in 2002 as web writer and editor for external relations. She was named Director of Web Communications in 2010, Assistant Director of Communications and Director of Digital Communications in 2012, and Executive Director of Communications and Public Affairs in 2016. At Washington and Lee, she has served on the 2018 Strategic Planning Steering Committee and the search committees for the Director of Institutional History and the Vice President of University Advancement. She has been President of the House Corporation for the Virginia Theta Chapter of Pi Beta Phi and a member of her 15th, 20th, and 25th reunion committees. She served on the executive board of the College Communicators Association of Virginia and DC in 2016 and is currently a ruling elder and chair of the Communications Committee at Lexington Presbyterian Church. Thank you so much. Let's congratulate them. Now we'll recognize our student initiates, and I'll start with the undergraduate class of 2020. Christopher Luke Basham. Brianna Ray Bells. William Warner Bolton. Daniel Scarborough Clark. Emma Marian Durr. Trong Ha Duong. Balin Victor Essig in absentia. Cassandra Noel Hall. Catherine Rose Ingram. Bria Young Kelly. Juliana Caroline Kerper. Jiwon Kim. Anne Elise Lentz. Nicholas Bennett Maurer. Prakriti Panthi. Mitchell Cooper Thomas. And Kana Krista White. Let's give them a round of applause. Next, we'll recognize the undergraduate class of 2021. Danica Taylor Brockman. Sarah Concepcion. Amanda Nicole Dorsey. Micah W. Holcomb. William Chase Isbell. Robert Sellers Lowercade. Geronimo Leonardo Reyes Olmedo. Let's give them a round of applause. Now we'll recognize the law school class of 2020 initiates. Whitney Elena Davis. Bonnie Susan Gill. Natalie Elizabeth Gordon. Mahalia Shanae Hall. Natalia Nacha Fomchek. Ryan Edward Johnson. Emily Grace Kendall. Madison Victoria Peace. Courtney Joy McMullen. Catherine Virginia Phillips. Congratulations. And now we'll recognize the law school class of 2021. Charles Bonani. Alexandra Preston Clark. Emily Culler D'Alessio. Lucy Geneva Dempsey. Lauren Nicole Hancock. And Daniel Justin Cater. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. That concludes our tapping ceremony.
Thank you, Laura, and on behalf of the Washington and Lee community, I offer warmest congratulations to all of the new initiates who exemplify the ODK ideals of leadership through service, obligation to others, and individual sacrifice. To our new student initiates, please take a moment to reflect upon the accomplishments of our honorary initiates. Take inspiration from them, set your sights high. We will be watching with great interest as you grow as university leaders, as well as leaders in your professions and communities in the years to come. Would everyone please stand as the university singers perform the Washington and Lee hymn? We will be adjourned upon its completion. Thank you.
As the